Hi, this is Jeff Liu, and this will be the CG animation commentary where I talk about the technical details of Killer Bean Forever. And let's start with the dancing scene. So the dancing scene was mostly motion capture. I just retouched up on top of the motion capture. And I started pretty easy with still cameras. Nothing's moving, just the character. Now going into this shot, this is one continuous shot and it lasts about 1 minute and 30 seconds. And I tried to experiment with the camera movement a little bit with changing and shifting the camera angle to the beat of the music. So that's something I wanted to play around with. This shot gets bigger and bigger, and I was using 32-bit software at the time, so I kept running out of memory when I added more and more dancing beans. So what I did was I split up this shot into 3 different scene files, and I just edited it together to be one continuous shot, but really it was 3 different shots, just for memory's sake. So the dancing beans were all using pretty much the same animation, but I offset them by 2 or 3 frames to get that organic feel, and you can see that a lot in this part right here where the beans aren't totally synchronized. They're kind of off by a little bit, and I felt like that gave them a more natural look to them, so it's not so choreographed, you know. It's one organic mass. And we're coming to the end of the shot, and the orange bean, I had like 3 different orange beans in that one shot, so I turned them on and off as I needed them. It wasn't animation on one character for the entire shot. It was just like a bunch of different orange beans. So I use a lot of shallow depth of field, especially on close-up shots.
Alright, sucker. You come down here, we can dance.
And I feel like shallow depth of field really gives that cinematic look.
Beach.
But rendering close-up shots really takes a lot more rendering time because of the sampling. The rendering samples go up the more out of focus things are in the background. So here's the introduction to Killer Bean, and it's like a revealing type of camera move.
I don't get enough sleep. I get
Most of the head acting and head motion and lip syncing was using my poor man's motion capture, and I'll talk about poor man's motion capture a lot. You could see how I did it in my making of Killer Bean Forever featurette on this DVD. Now we're getting into the action. Almost all of the action was hand keyframed, except for the rigid body dynamics. Like when the beans get shot, they bounce off the floor, they bounce off the walls, and that's something I didn't want to animate because doing something like that is really difficult to make sure that the hands and feet don't go through the ground or the walls when they bounce off of them. So I used a lot of shaky camera motion here, and the shaky camera motions tracked. I had a real camera and I tracked a dot on the wall, and I just shook the camera around and I tracked that motion, and then I added that into my scenes here. This part here is particularly hand animated because I couldn't really get motion capture that fit what I wanted it to. That slam dunking motion was animated at 24 frames per second, and I slowed it down during render time because I felt like to animate a slow motion action would be much more difficult than to animate a real-time 24 frames per second action. So what I did was I just animated it like it was real time, and then when it came time to render it, I just changed the scene frame rate to 240 frames per second. So it spit out 10 times more frames than what I originally planned for, and what I got was a slow motion shot. So it's a real quick and easy way to do slow motion.
Wait, who are you?
All of the dialogue here, the head acting and the mouth motion was done with the poor man's motion capture. The eyelids I hand animated myself.
On the phone. I said I would come here to turn it off myself. What?
I forgot to do the eyelids on that one shot.
You know what you just got yourself into? Do you know who I am?
Yeah, for these I picked up the eyelids and do the eyeball animation. So this title sequence was pretty much all particle illusion, and the effect was pretty much right out of the box in particle illusion. I just put my cast members' names on top of these little flashy things, and that was basically it. The 2D transitions were all done in my editing software, which was called Vegas, but I'll call it my editing software just for clarity, because if I say like, oh, I did this in Vegas, you know, might sound like something else. So yeah, I'll call it my editing software. Here we have a scene that's outside in the night, and basically my lighting setup was the same for every scene. I had a dome light for ambient light, and then maybe a bounce light if it's like a bright day, and then of course environmental lights for nighttime, like the street lights or the car headlights. And so this scene was using a dome light with very dark blue very saturated dark blue lights, and you get that really like, you know, very early morning blue look to it.
Multiple gunshots were reported coming from this warehouse. I was the first one answering.
This scene was pretty easy to animate. This was also using a lot of my poor man's motion capture.
You do know whose warehouse.
Except for stuff like the hands and the gun, that stuff was all hand animated, but everything else like the head, the mouth,
No, sir.
that area was mostly poor man's motion capture.
Well, it's here.
This is basically the aftermath of the action scene, and quite literally that's what it is in Maya, in my scene file. After the action sequence, I destroyed a lot of stuff, like that barrels blew up and the glass everywhere. That happened all in the action sequence, and all I had to do was load up that same scene and then started this scene after all the animation happened, so nothing's moving, and that's what I ended up with. I didn't really art direct this scene to look like it was destroyed. So it was literally destroyed from all the action that happened earlier.
Must have been some kind of gang war.
No, this is no gang war. Cappuccino's beans might be dumb, but they know how to use a gun. That would have been other dead beans.
This sequence has a lot of close-up shots.
Something else.
You'll see coming up that we get really close up on some bullet casings, and I like to use a lot of depth of field, a lot of shallow depth of field, but the closer you get to an object, the more samples you have to crank up. So depth of field uses a lot of ray tracing, and you'll see here like this shot and another shot coming up. Like this shot. So this one used about 1,024 samples of depth of field, and I had to do that to make sure that the background was smooth and not noisy or gritty. So the more shallow your depth of field, you have to bump up the sampling to make everything look smooth that's not in focus.
We got company.
Let's go. Stop. Stop right there.
This is the police. Hold it right there.
So here, when Cromwell shoots out the tires of the SUV, that was done with a lattice deformer on the tires, and I basically animated the CVs of the lattice, and I pulled them out to make the tires look like they're deflating.
Easy, easy.
Oh, please, officer, don't hurt me.
Watch it.
Vegan. I should have known.
When animating cameras, when you move cameras, different camera moves mean different things. Like pushing in means something else than like pulling out or panning across or craning up and down. Every camera move means something different, and the speed that you do it means something different. So it's definitely like a cinematic language, like a film language that you have to learn if you want to get into filmmaking. But yeah, the camera is really important. Sometimes you could tell a story completely with just camera. It's a good thing to study. It's a good thing to know.
Yeah? That's because I'd be shooting you with this.
Are you kids done yet?
I say we take him in and book him right now.
So when you're moving a camera across your shot in one shot, it's a good idea to, of course, start off with a good composition, but you also have to keep in mind where the camera ends up. So at the end of the shot, you should also try to reframe your shot to keep a good composition also. It doesn't have to be the same exact composition. It just has to be a good one.
However, investigating the multiple homicides in your warehouse is.
So just keep in mind that if you start off with a good composition, end up with one, because the beginning and ends of a shot are pretty much the most important. What happens in the middle, you might lose your composition in the middle of a shot. That's okay, because it might be impossible to have a good camera composition throughout the entire shot. But just try to have it like composed pretty well in the beginning and ends. So here we have a really big traveling shot, and this is something that might be really difficult to do in live action, where we go down the street, we go pretty fast, and we fly up to Killer Bean's window, and we fly right through the window, and then kind of arc around Killer Bean. That type of move would be pretty hard to do in live action. Not impossible, but definitely hard to do. And that's one of the benefits of CG, because it's really easy to do in CG, but it also gives away that the camera move is a CG camera. Most of the time when you're working with camera moves in CG, it's a good idea to abide by the rules of a real camera. Like, the camera has to abide by real physics. It has real weight. You can't move it like it's made out of plastic, So if you abide by those types of rules when doing your camera moves, like if you crane up and down, it'll make your camera moves look a lot more realistic. Here, looking through the scope, you could tell near the borders of the scope that the image kind of refracts, and I did that because I wanted a more realistic, like a glass lens type of look, and the refracting part was done in my editing software. It has like a displacement thing where you can actually use a black and white image, a lot like a bump map in CG in 3D. So I did that in Vegas, basically, my editing software.
Great. Playtime's over.
So the stuff going on in the screen of the cell phone is all an animated texture. Basically, I had an animated background and I put text on top of it. All of that stuff was edited in my editing software, and I used it as a animated texture in Maya, and I just basically projected that onto the phone, and that's what you get.
We know what kind of night you had. Might I remind you?
So the lighting in this scene is pretty simple, but you have to be aware of bounce lights. So you have a really strong light coming through the window. That's not the only light that's going to be cast in this scene, in this room. You have to be aware of bounce lights from the walls, from the floor. So light bouncing off the floor is going to be a different color than light bouncing off the white walls. The floor is going to reflect some of that saturated brown or saturated kind of orangish brown color right back up to Killer Bean.
Remember who he is.
Yeah, I know what the mission is.
Then stick to it. Don't be so reckless, Killer Bean.
I'll call you.
So here in the background, there's like those telephone wires going across. I had to bump up the samples for my depth of field. Lines, thin lines that are blurred out in depth of field tend to get very noisy. They get the noisiest compared to other objects in shallow depth of field. So it's best to just bump up the samples and, bite the bullet on that, just let it run on your render farm. So this scene was pretty easy to make. Also, it rendered very quickly because there's not much in this scene. The walls are pretty bare, and I try to hide that fact with close-up shots, using depth of field to blur out stuff and to make the viewer's attention on Jet Bean. So of course, it's impossible to hide the fact that it's pretty bare, but I do my best, I guess. Well, not really. I was constrained for time, but it's the best I could do at that time.
It figures. Fine. I'll do
So
it.
as you see that moving shot, I started with one composition, ending up with another one on the side of his face. But hopefully I kept a good composition from beginning, at least in the beginning and then at the end.
Wait. Are you leaving? Yes. How long will you go for? A long time. Oh.
One of the things I did to study camera composition was actually just look at movies, pick a movie that you like to watch from some of your favorite directors or favorite cinematographers. And what I did was I watched it on the computer, and I basically had the sound off, and I just looked for shots that I really liked, looked for shots that really appealed to me. And if I liked it, I would take a screen grab, and I would copy that shot and put it in a folder. So after a while, watching through the whole movie, going through different shots, I had this big collection of shots that I liked. So I would just flip through those directories every now and then see lots of different composition ideas, lots of different camera angles, the lighting, everything about cinematography, basically, just from a not like a classroom perspective, but just like a show and tell type of thing, trial and error type of thing. And you can learn a lot by looking at movies in a different way than you should look at them. Look at it for different aspects, like look at it for lighting once, and then look at it for cinematography once. Look at it for writing, things like that. You could break it down many times.
But you guys are not from my weapons department, are you? Oh, you guys are from my narcotic department, okay?
So this scene, it was really important to get the sunlight down correctly. I wanted it to look realistic, so it's for objects that cast shadows that aren't too far to the object that received the shadows. I wanted the shadows to look pretty sharp. But if the object casting the shadow is far away from the object receiving a shadow, I wanted it to soften to get that realistic sunlight look. Especially during early mornings, like 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock.
Right? What's the problem here? Now you guys, someone give me a
lot of these shots here, I kind of hid Cappuccino's feet. Even though the walking cycle was a motion capture thing, it was still kind of sloppy around his feet area. The feet were kind of going through the floor, things like that. And plus I didn't really have a cloth simulation, so I wanted to hide that kind of animation. I mean, you saw right there that it was like close up on his feet. But yeah, I didn't want you to look at his feet too much. It wasn't the main focus of this scene. Really, it was Cappuccino's face was the main focus.
Lay off a few beans.
Here, breaking through the glass, basically I swapped out a real, like just a polygonal plane with a group of shards that I had hidden, and I just turned them on, and then I had a baked out dynamic simulation, and I turned it on right when the shards were like blowing out. It's like a sleight of hand kind of thing.
Go up after this.
So the lighting on the glass was pretty important, especially around the edges of the glass. So that's why it's really important to get instead of using a flat plane, use like a rectangle that's pretty thin, so you get thickness in the glass, and definitely have refraction. So when the light hits it at different angles, especially on the broken glass area, it looks more realistic than just like plastic looking or looking really thin.
Making millions of dollars selling weapons. If you ask me.
Definitely, on a lot of these shots in the movie, I use depth of field or shallow depth of field to my advantage. Like a shot like this, I want to hide the fact that the beans in the background aren't moving at all. You're not really supposed to focus on those guys, so I put them out of focus, and hopefully it works. That you don't notice that the guys aren't really moving.
Not about the party.
It's all a balance of what's important to the scene, what's important to the shot, and how much work you have to do to pull it off. Like, I wanted to do the least amount of work possible, and not animating those beans was one of them. Making my camera closer to the character was pretty easy to get the shallow depth of field.
I've heard of him before. I know what he can do.
Who the hell is he? Who sent him? Is it the Colombians? Is it the French?
So a lot of times,
It has to be one of your competitors.
when characters are turning around or moving around in the scene,
You to find
I had them turn in a close-up and then cut to a wide shot to show them walking, because I had a lot of straight walking motion capture, but I didn't have a motion capture where the characters were like, walking, turning, and in different directions. Not that much. So to cheat, I would have them turn in close-up where you don't really see their hands and feet, and then cut to a wider shot where they're actually walking.
What about Killer Bean?
Lots of times when I show them walking close up, like their heads and shoulders, and you see their bodies bopping up and down, I don't even animate the rest of their bodies. Like, their feet and hands are basically still, and they're just sliding across. I mean, unless you have some object that's going to reflect and you see their bodies in the reflection, nobody's really going to know.
Put it on my credit card, okay? Just do it.
Yes, sir.
Again? Make sure you find out who sent him. There will be hell to pay.
So this scene was pretty much the first scene I rendered and animated. I actually went back and re-rendered this later on, about a year later than I first rendered it with. Initially, I rendered it with Maya, the Maya software renderer, and then once I figured out my rendering pipeline, I started using Final Render, and I went back and re-rendered this scene because the renders didn't really match. The colors and lighting matched pretty well, but the depth of field was a lot different. So I went back and re-rendered this scene. This scene was really easy to animate. The only hard part was that the stuff that's going on Cromwell's monitor. All this stuff was basically it's like a almost a short film by itself. Like I had a lot of different shots where I animated the camera moving around, or I animated it in my editing software to move in 2D, and then I also had to create those icons on the left part of his monitor to make it look like, you know, stuff's happening, to make it less boring, you know. If I make the monitor busy, then hopefully the scene gets a lot denser.
One thing's for sure. He has his eyes set on
It wasn't very fun to do all this extra stuff to show on the computer monitor, but I felt like I needed it.
If that's true, I have a hunch where this killer bean will show up next. Hey, I gotta go. I'll see you, Harry.
Later.
This was a pretty early scene to render. This was one of the first scenes I rendered in Final Render. But it matches pretty well with the later scenes that I rendered. I mean, I got my technique more polished for different scenes. This was an earlier scene that I was trying to figure out the rendering pipeline. Here's another slow motion shot, and you know, same thing. It's a fast motion animation that I just rendered at higher frames per second. This shot took a long time to render because I had displacement maps on the bricks to make them look more realistic. Same thing for that slow motion shot, animated in fast speed, and then just run it at higher frames per second, and the entire shot is slow motion. So I didn't have to slow down the glass and figure out what speed the glass had to be. The entire scene was slower the same amount, you know. It's really cool. It's a really easy technique. So those bullets into the ground, that's just basically a rigid body dynamics. I had like a cylinder that I shattered using the shatter tool, and then I just blew it out in dynamics. I show this in the making of section in the special features, so definitely check it out. That was a 2D comp in my editing software using some wavy noise and some pixelation. So shooting through the glass, basically I had a like a stunt double glass pane. I had a intact glass pane, and then I had a glass pane that was completely shattered up using the shatter tool. And then I made different sections dynamic at different times because I knew the bullet wasn't big enough to blast through the whole window all in one shot. It had like very many different smaller shots going through the glass. So for each bullet shot, I grouped that little area and I made those shards dynamic, and then baked that part out, and then I would go back and do the same thing for lots of different bullet shot areas. So you get an effect where the bullets are just breaking through different parts of the window at different times.
Time for some breakfast.
So here on close-up shots like this, you got to be conscious of the texture resolution. That resolution there wasn't as good as I probably should have it, but I like that shot, but I probably should have higher resolution for the door. But fortunately, it's a very short shot, and you don't really, hopefully you won't remember it that well. So the stuff on the TV was basically just like the stuff on Cromwell's monitor and Killer Bean's cell phone. This shot was done earlier, and then I just put it as a texture on the TV. Plus with the text logo stuff, I comped it in. using my editing software.
I don't think so. I'll have another. And you can turn that crap off now.
So you'll see in this sequence what I was talking about in terms of making the character look like he's walking without actually moving his feet. I think I do it a lot in this shot, in this sequence. So here's one shot. I just bop his hips up and down. This one definitely has a walk in it. I think that was motion capture. Over here it was just animated with his body going up and down. So when he puts his gun in his holster, it's kind of like a switcheroo type of thing. I didn't really slide that gun into the holster. I just put it away where you can't see the gun anymore, and then I turned it off and then turned on a gun that's already in his holster, and it kind of looks like he put his gun in there. I didn't really want to take the time and, you know, animate the gun going in his holster and making sure that things didn't penetrate different objects. That would have been too time consuming, and it wasn't really that important either.
I'll have what he's having.
So one of the harder things to do in this scene was making the glass look like it was glass. And since I was using ambient occlusion pass, I basically had to refract the glass in the ambient occlusion pass also. Or else it really wouldn't look realistic. The liquid that's shaking around after he hits the glass onto the bar top is really just geometry, and I just use a blend shape to kind of move the liquid inside the glass back and forth. So it's really just it's really just a solid object that I just move the top part of that object back and forth.
You are...
Jack.
Well, Jack. I guess you heard what happened this morning over at the...
This was a very early scene for me to animate. This was, I think, either the second scene for me to work on. And I wanted to test out my poor man's motion capture using two characters. I wanted to see if it was possible, basically, to get a two-person or more than one character motion capture thing going. You know, I wanted to know if it would work.
The hole in the window also belongs to Cappuccino. I see this fancy car parked in front.
And the hardest thing for doing more than one character is to sync up the audio, to sync up the dialogue between the two characters. So doing the poor man's motion capture, lots of times when the character is listening to the other character, you still have to act, because I like to use reaction shots a lot when editing back and forth, especially when one guy's saying something that's kind of important to the other character. I like to show the other character more than the guy that's talking. So you definitely have to keep up the acting on parts where the character is listening, and that's part of acting. It's the listening to the other actor and reacting to what he says.
That's a nice gun. Want to see mine?
So that shot's, I don't know what you call that in film terms, but that's like when you pull a camera back or you push it forward while you're zooming out the lens or you're zooming in the lens. So basically the object that's in focus remains the same size, but the perspective changes because the camera's moving and also zooming at the same time.
Not bad, but mine's bigger.
So let me talk about the gold for the gun. The gold was pretty important to make it look like real gold, and the way I did that was basically for plastic objects, the specular highlights are often white. Or for glass objects, if you have like a red glass jar or a red glass bottle, the specular would probably be white, I guess, or especially for red plastic bottles. But for metals, often the specular color is a brighter version of the diffuse color, and that gives it a very metallic look. So the gold, I had a very kind of dull, dark brown for the diffuse color, and for the specular, I had a really saturated, bright yellow, and that gave it a nice gold look to it.
It's too bad, because I know where Central Warehouse is. Not these abandoned warehouses.
So for that note that Cromwell slides over, I don't know if you saw it, but I had a fold in that note. I thought it was a nice touch. It was a small detail that I like to put in, but I don't know if it was that important, enough to waste time on. But I just wanted to point it out so you guys saw it, that I did put that amount of detail into the fold into the note.
And the evidence says it could have been some rival gang that killed all the Cappuccino's beans last night, or it could be you. And I have a lot of evidence that says that.
Are you gonna take me in?
I can take you down.
So when they're putting their fingers on the guns, it's, a lot of people might think that 3D animation might make things easier where they're really 3D hard surfaces, but they're really not. I mean, the fingers can penetrate real easily on through the guns, and it's one of the more important things in animation to animate things to look like they're not penetrating through objects, and to make them look like they're actually really solid objects with real weight, really hard surfaces. And that's definitely an animation thing. That's not a simulation thing going on here.
Okay. I'm gonna slowly lower my gun. And I'm gonna go, alright? Alright? This will be real easy. See? This is easy. Killer Bean, remember what I said. We can help each other.
Just help yourself out the door.
So another thing to mention is that there is a very convenient bar that's hiding a lot of the characters' feet, and especially helped a lot with the bartender, so I didn't really have to animate him. But over here he looks kind of dopey, just rotating. But it's a thing that I do to make the animation a lot easier, make it a lot quicker. Same thing here. You see Cromwell bending over, and he's picking up the note. Well, I don't show him picking up the note with his fingers. I just show him bending over, and you hear him picking up the note. It's not really important to see his fingers like scrape the note off the sidewalk and then pick it up. That stuff is really hard to animate, and it just doesn't add much to the movie.
You only flushed once.
I feel like sometimes it's a lot more important to see the character's face and see what they're thinking rather than seeing what their hands are doing.
Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?
Who is Shadow Bean?
You're in way over your head.
Who is Shadow Bean?
You don't have to yell. I'm right next to you.
Answer me.
This little dialogue moment was pretty easy to do. It's using my, poor man's motion capture. I was pretty close up on the heads and shoulders, but once they start grappling, it gets a lot more difficult to do because
So, I'll have to do this instead.
having two characters wrestle or grab each other or throw each other, you have to make sure that one character is not penetrating through another, first of all. And also, you have to make sure that the weight looks right, that the one character who's throwing the other character, that he's moving in such a way and such a speed to give a believable weight to the other character.
You're not as dumb as you look.
So, grappling and wrestling are definitely probably the most difficult things to animate, especially when you have to keep in mind that these guys can't penetrate through each other.
Hello.
Harry, it's Cromwell.
Hey.
My hunch was right. Killer Bean hid Cappuccino's warehouse on the east side. In fact,
Here's another scene where Cromwell's just sitting. You just see his head and shoulders and mouth.
listen,
That's about it.
I got some new info. I found a note in front of Cappuccino's warehouse. It said, "Shadow Bean, you are too late." Does that mean anything to you? Harry, you still there?
I didn't know they were still in operation.
So this shot was also rendered early on. This was rendered in the Maya software renderer, and I used Mental Ray for the ambient occlusion.
Highly trained operatives of an
But that was when I was still figuring out the rendering pipeline.
Shadow Agency? What are they, a government agency? Why haven't I heard of them?
I think they were a private organization. There are some things the government does that are not meant to be known. Their collaboration with the Shadow Agency was one of them. When diplomatic and military tactics failed, our government hired the Shadow Agency to eliminate national security threats. It was more cost-effective than training and maintaining our own elite assassins. And the Shadow Beans were better than anything we had.
Great. But why here? What are the Shadow Beans doing in Beantown? And what
So,
can they possibly want with
There's not much to
Cappuccino?
talk about in this scene. It's
I thought the Shadow
that's all it is. I try to change up the camera angles and
stopped using them
try to
nearly a
make things
decade
look different, but
I haven't
it
heard of them since.
this is basically all it is, just Cromwell listening on the phone. I mean,
Sounds like he's certainly good enough to be.
not much for me to animate since I had my whole mocap system figured out.
But you can start by putting all your cops on double duty.
Right.
So this nighttime scene, it uses a lot less saturated blues than I did for the early morning scene. I have really dark, not so saturated dark blues.
It's so freaking boring. All we do is sit around and drink beer.
Are you kidding? This is my dream job.
This whole sequence in the big warehouse with all the crates and different objects in the scene, I kept running out of memory for shots that show the crates, for shots that have lots of objects and characters. So what I did was I had a bunch of different warehouse models. I had models where you only saw the right side of the warehouse and everything else that you didn't see was gone. It was just empty. And then I had like the left side warehouse, and I had warehouses where you just saw the ceilings, or warehouses where you just looked at the ground, and that reduced the amount of memory I needed. And I just had to switch out the model in the reference editor. It was one of the limitations I had in this production because I was using 32-bit software. Even if I had more than 2 gigs of RAM, it wouldn't be able to access all that memory. So definitely using 64-bit software is a huge plus. Then you can just get the RAM you need and not worry about making all these different proxy models. So I mean, it goes the same with the characters. The characters that were close to camera, I had much denser, much higher resolution models than the characters that were in the background. I mean, when you're dealing with memory budgets, like amounts of memory or memory limitations, you had to do everything like that. I guess it's it's sort of like working in video games where you have a limited computer system or video card system, and you know, the stuff that's far away you have to keep low res. Like the textures were really low res in the backgrounds, characters were low res.
Not really.
The closer you get, the higher the resolution. This action sequence with the one long shot here with all these characters moving in and out, it took a long time to make. I think this shot took about a week to animate, but I really liked how it came out.
Hello.
They, we're being attacked. I think it's Killer Bean.
How do you know?
Well, he's killing everyone.
We're sending the mercenaries. Just hold tight.
Keep firing! Don't let up!
So the grenades here are just rigid body dynamics. I just tossed them and I let them bounce however they want to bounce. And the explosion was particle illusion. I had two different explosions, one in front of the other to give it some depth. And I put a point light in between. I made those explosions translucent so they would catch light. And it really pulled off the explosion. It made it look like the explosion was in the scene, not just a 2D cheat. So the binoculars are kind of like the scope, the sniper scope on Killer Bean's rifle. Yeah, the edges were kind of refracted off to make it look more realistic. Now this armored personnel carrier, when it hits the wall, when it hits the garage door, it shatters, and that's using rigid body dynamics. And then when it hits the crates, it's also rigid body. The difference is when it hits through the doors, the pieces of the garage door don't collide with one another. They just blow out. But the crates, the resolution was low enough that I could let the crates bounce off each other, and it was pretty important because they had to land on each other and create a pile of crates. So you see on the ground on this scene, there's a lot of broken glass, a lot of broken shards. It's a lot like how I was saying in the first action sequence that I destroyed the warehouse as I went along. And basically, I did the action sequences in sequence. So whatever broke in the beginning of the sequence, then I built upon that. I used that file for the next shot. And then whatever destroyed in that shot, I used that file for, the shot after. So I didn't really have to set dress anything. Everything just happened the way it did.
I led these beans through 3 tours of duty, accumulating a total of 15 medals of honor, 11 Purple Hearts. Sure, we lost a few good beans.
So all of the mercenary beans in the background, they pretty much all have the same animation. I did about 3 different types of head motion and mouth movements, and I just offset them so that they don't happen at the same time. But basically all these like 12 different beans have the same, are using the same 3 different animations. I just mixed it up, I made them happen so they didn't look like they're all happening at the same time. So they all look pretty unique in the end.
We even robbed a few federal banks when business was slow. So this little shindig we got here, it's nothing. It's just a walk in the park. Are you going to say something or what?
Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. I must have totally zoned out on you. Whoa, my eyes are starting to water. Whew. Sorry. Let's make one thing clear. Last night was a party. Tonight, I get to work.
So here, that explosion is the same thing when the hydrogen tanks explode. All those pieces are left where they are. So every shot after that shot will have those pieces lying on the ground. So that shot where Killer Bean's shooting out of the garage door, that's a good use of a lot of ragdoll dynamics. When the Bean with the rocket launcher shoots the missile trail is basically one long polygon with the texture of smoke projected onto it. It doesn't really work that well. It looks really flat still, but I try to distract from it with other action going on in the shot. Here I shot spheres at the, like, I guess what do you call it, the roller table. I basically had a bunch of rigid body spheres, like about 20 of them, and I launched them one at a time like a machine gun at that table, and I angled the spheres, you know, like a gun would, and I just destroyed those rollers, you know, and it worked pretty well. It was a pretty easy setup. So this shot here, it's kind of like that idea that I had on Cromwell where the camera is moving but also zooming out at the same time, so the perspective changes while the camera moves, and that's the same sort of effect on that bullet traveling. I think the camera's following the bullet, but the camera widens out a lot, and then it kind of zooms back in at the end of the shot. So here I had the effect of the glass shattering as that motorcycle hit the building. Hopefully it made the impact look a lot bigger. So here when Vagan shoots the motorcycle, that smoke is not done in Maya. It was done in particle illusion. And I had the rendered frames of that motorcycle animation, and I brought it into particle illusion, and I tracked the motion of the camera because the camera is shaking. So I basically tracked the motorcycle, and I added the smoke in particle illusion, and it makes the it makes the effect look a lot more volumetric rather than projecting that smoke onto a polygon.
He's awake.
So, this is a great killer bean.
Yeah.
You attack my
So for Cappuccino, since I didn't have a cloth simulation for his clothes, and I didn't really want to animate the clothes moving back and forth, even though I probably should have, but I just didn't have that time to go back and do that kind of detailed animation. So I did a lot of the camera setups as close-ups.
No, you did not.
So a lot of times you don't see his the bottom of his coat. You just see his head and shoulders.
You did.
What do you want, Killer Bean? Who are you working for?
What? You expect me to just blurt it all out?
My nephew was at the Baker Street warehouse when you attacked it, okay? I think you owe me an explanation.
Your nephew? Oh, your nephew.
He was such a good boy. He wanted to be a DJ at some big nightclub. I told him, someday I'll buy you your own nightclub.
On this shot where you see Killer Bean and Cappuccino at the same time, even though Killer Bean's out of focus slightly, you still tend to look at him, so it's important to keep him moving to make him look like he's still alive.
I remember him. He was the one playing the music.
You always love his music.
He's dead now.
Kill this being. He's wasting my time.
It's about time.
How does it feel to be killed by your own gun?
Funny.
So when I did this animation of Killer Bean breaking out of the chair, I wanted it to be very quick and sweet, like a very decisive motion. So he does like 2 behind the back shots, and then he turns around and shoots the other 2 beans.
Are we done?
It was pretty fun to animate that little sequence here. Animating beans shooting each other is pretty fun because it's not that hard. I mean, animating beans punching each other and kicking each other and wrestling with each other, that's pretty hard. That's not too fun to do. But shooting each other, it's pretty fun. So
There's no rush. I got time. Cromwell out.
How dare you? How dare you come onto my property looking to
so
kill me?
3D sequences and scenes,
Burst your bubble,
it
Cappuccino.
uses a lot of the poor man's motion capture, and that saved me a lot of time.
Here to kill him.
Because when I was doing these scenes or these few sequences in this area,
You wanna
there is 1 month where I made about 13 minutes of animation in just 1 month, and compare that to the animation production
No.
that I did for the action sequences, like that mercenary battle sequence.
Two?
That took me about 2 months to do for the entire action sequence.
Actually,
And that sequence was, I don't know how long it was, maybe like 2 or 3 minutes long.
I like to
So production-wise, it was a lot faster for me to do dialogue than action. But, you know, it is an action movie, so I definitely have to have action in it. But it was definitely a luxury to be able to do the dialogue scenes so easily. So here we have a pretty long dialogue sequence, and
Someone with some talent after me.
you know, there's not much to it.
The best for you.
All I had to really animate were the eyelids and the eyes, you know, wherever the eyes looked. Everything else was pretty much poor man's motion capture. So I think what I'll talk about in this sequence is the difference between the inside and outside. So if you look in the backgrounds, if you look through the windows or the garage door, we can't see it in this shot, but we'll wait till another shot.
What? You're the one who destroyed our database and stole years of intelligence work. How could you do that? And how could you go...
For example, if you look through that window, it's dark outside. It's like dark blue outside. And over here you see it pretty nicely. Since I was using a dome light
to get rid of the trash and
that didn't really cast shadows, I couldn't render the backgrounds and the foregrounds at the same time, because if I did, then the outside would look that same green look that you see on the inside. This is pretty much the same thing. There's a blue outside and a bright green inside. So what I did was I had to render in 2 different layers. Rendered the background first with a dark blue dome light. Then I turned off the backgrounds and I turned on the foregrounds or the inside of the warehouse, and I rendered that with the bright green, like pale green lights. And then I pretty much brought those 2 layers in together in my editing software and just composited them together, and that's what you get. But when you render the ambient occlusion, you have to render both layers at the same time, because you can't really render a background ambient occlusion. I mean, you could render them separately, but why not just render them both at the same time? Because
do you expect me to believe
ambient occlusion, the colors don't matter. It's just gonna be black or white. So
and stole years of intelligence
yeah, those were okay to render in the same scene.
All the information I took was mine. I wasn't about to give up 12 years of sweat and blood. I needed it to continue my work.
and exactly
So I try to change the camera angles up here a lot when doing this scene, because not much is going on. They're just standing there in front of each other, just aiming their guns at each other. So I try to mix it up with a lot of shallow depth of field, lots of camera motion,
But unlike it,
using different angles.
I can
I try to get to, you know, profile look of the characters, and then switch it up to a more frontal view of them.
More minutes of life with that story, Dark Bean. But you can't out-talk my trigger finger.
It doesn't matter if you believe me or not. This is probably your last mission. If I don't kill you, the Shadow Agency will.
What the hell are you talking about? I'm one of their best shadow beings. Why would they want me dead?
The Shadow Agency knows I can expose them. Any agent that comes in contact.
I think in this sequence I use a lot of framing techniques, using other objects to frame your character. Like this one, I use Vagan to frame Killer Bean, where Vagan kind of covers 1/3 of the shot or half of the shot, and the rest of the shot is just Killer Bean in focus. So that's like a framing technique, a frame within a frame. You know, it's like a frame, using objects to frame your character that's inside the frame of your camera shot.
Dead. Then why even send me on this mission?
You said it yourself. You're one of their best. They tried to kill me before. They sent Shadow Beans after me twice. They both failed. Think about it, Killer Bean.
So a lot of these camera moves have motion in them, and camera motion adds to the production value. And production value is really, it's really where the money goes. You know, where the budget goes in a production, and hopefully it goes on screen. And that's what production value is, what you see on screen. So I have a lot of moving cameras because in live action movie making, moving cameras cost more than still cameras. Still cameras, you just buy a tripod and you just stick it on a tripod. But moving cameras require things like a crane or a dolly, or, you know, some truck or whatever, you know, or a steady cam. And that stuff costs a lot more than just putting it on a tripod. So in terms of production value, moving cameras look more expensive than still cameras, but in CG they're really easy to make. Like a moving camera doesn't really cost more than a still cam. It just requires like a little bit more keyframes, but not much else. So production value is easy to do in CG in terms of camera moves, but other stuff is a lot harder to do.
We're both dead beans.
And here you see the reverse of what I was talking about from the inside. You have the outside, which is now the foreground, and the inside of the warehouse acts as the background. So I had a really bright background, and I put the dark blue foreground on top of that. So the water here is just a moving bump map. It's not even a displacement map. I thought it worked quite well since we're pretty far away from water.
Yes, I am here.
So that little flashing icon thing, that was also done in particle illusion.
And who is the target?
Now, if you look at the camera motion, if you look at the camera for Killer Bean versus the camera motion for Jet Bean, for Killer Bean, I use a lot of shaky cam, like handheld camera motion. For Jet Bean, I use a lot of just still, very slow moving camera motion. To do the handheld shaky camera motion, I basically, it's sort of like, you know how I did for the poor man's motion capture. If you saw the making of sequence or the making of featurette, I tracked my head doing motion. Well, basically for the handheld shaky cam, I basically had my camcorder and I aimed it at a dot on the wall while my hand was shaking around. So I just tracked that, a real hand shaking motion, and I put it back on the camera in Maya. So here for the police car sirens, I basically built them like real police car sirens. I had a light bulb and a mirror-like metal object that's rotating around it, and it worked pretty well. It looks like a real siren on those cars. So for the buildings, the building lights, I didn't place the lights on there. I didn't have different rooms, or I didn't texture each window differently. I basically had a really low resolution texture. It looked almost like a mosaic of a dark and light green, and I just put those on the buildings, and basically every window, bright window you see is basically one gigantic pixel, one gigantic square pixel, and it worked pretty well.
Drop your guns! Put them down now!
It's not gonna end like this.
Drop your guns!
So in this sequence, much like the mercenary sequence, all of these cops are using pretty much the same animation. I just had three different types of head motion and mouth motion, and I just used the same ones for all of the cops. And I just shifted the animation at some random amount of frames, maybe not more than like a second or two of animation, maybe like 15 frames, or some odd numbers to randomize the animation for all the cops.
I'll never find out about the Shadow Agency or the Shadow Beans.
I can't help you.
Why not? You are a Shadow Bean, aren't you?
Not anymore.
So in this sequence, I brightened up Cromwell a bit. I brightened up the lighting on Cromwell because he was such a key figure in this scene, and I wanted to make him stand out from the rest of the police.
If you tell me what I need to know, I can protect you.
I highly doubt that.
I can at least give you a place to stay tonight. Let me help you, Killer Bean.
So you can see the subtle motion of the camera, of the police beans animation, but they're all using basically the same animations. They're just shifted in time, so they happen at different moments in time. So this part here is when Killer Bean tosses the guns. They're animated to a point where Killer Bean releases the guns, then it blends into rigid body dynamics.
Not exactly what.
So the prison is technically easy to make. It's just basically a room with brick textures on the walls. Not much going on in the scene, so it rendered very quickly.
I'll be back in the morning. We have a lot to talk about.
Who were these guys? I like to know where they get guns like this.
Hey, don't touch that stuff. You know better than that. You're contaminating the evidence.
So here it's you know, all the destruction that happened. I definitely did this scene after all the action sequences were done and after Vegan was shot. You know, all that is basically, all of this stuff is quite literally after all those sequences that happened earlier.
Whoa, hold it. This is a crime scene. No one is allowed on the premises.
Yeah, nobody ought to know.
I mean, it saved a lot of time. I didn't have to art direct these shots right here. I mean, I just stuck the characters, I stuck the police characters in the scene just the way it was.
Wait. Who are you?
Let me put it in a language you can understand. Oh, so sorry. No charm in here. You deliver. Wrong place.
So you see how Jet Bean has a kind of a long robe. For him, I just still didn't do any cloth simulation because I didn't have a cloth simulator. You know, it's the effects of having a real low budget. If I had a higher budget, you know, I'd have stuff like that, like like more cloth simulations or hair simulations. But since I didn't have it, I still wanted Jet Bean's clothes to kind of move around. So I made some blend shapes where the clothes would move up depending on what the leg motion would be. So I think I had about 4 blend shapes, like 2 for the front left and right leg motions and 2 for the back left and right leg motions. Oh, and also I had one that made the robe go side to side. So this is another scene that took a lot of RAM to render, but I think at this point I had my 64-bit rendering machine, so it wasn't too much of a problem.
Thanks for your help. I'm turning in for the night, and I'll be back in the morning.
Right, sir. We'll be here when you get back.
Excellent.
What do we got here?
Just some punk bean we caught assaulting an officer.
Well, he sure picked the wrong night to do that. Take him in.
So I wanted the car motions to look realistic. So you see when the cop gets out of the car, the weight kind of lifts off the car also. And here I have the same technique I used for the shattering windows in the sniper battle sequence. I have the cop shooting out the glass. This was another animation that was done in fast motion, and I just rendered it in slow motion.
Another move, and we drop you.
You know, and that's all rigid body dynamics. And still the pieces don't collide with each other. It makes the dynamic simulation run a lot quicker. So here I have the lights flashing. Other than those lights, those fluorescent lights that are on the shot, all I did was I turned off various lights on and off on the dome light setup, so they don't go dimmer and brighter. Just different lights turn off while others stay on, and then I turn the other ones off while, you know, I turn the other ones back on. So it was quite random which ones went off and which ones were still on. And this animation here with the gun clanging on the bars, there's no simulation here. It took me quite a while to animate the gun so it looked like it wasn't penetrating through the bars. So it looked like it was a solid, object. And it would have been nice to have some sort of simulation, but I don't think the R&D in that would have taken a lot longer than just animating the handgun. One of the things I was contemplating to do or not was what to do with Jet Bean's hair, because he has this big ponytail, and I didn't have a simulation system for his big ponytail. Like if I had Maya Unlimited, I could simulate that pretty easily, but since I just had Maya Complete, I had to hand animate his ponytail swinging around, and that was pretty time consuming for the fight scenes where you see his ponytail a lot. So there was one time where I actually thought like I would have Killer Bean shoot Jet Bean's ponytail off so I wouldn't have to animate it. And, I kept bouncing back and forth that idea. And I said, I don't know if I really want to do that, because it might look dopey. It wasn't the best idea. It was just an idea to make my life easier as an animator. But I don't, as a director, I didn't really like that idea too much. So I didn't have that happen. And I ended up having to animate the ponytail throughout the whole fight scene.
And I don't ask.
They decided to kill me the moment they sent me on this mission, didn't they? That's what Darkbeam told me.
So here's another use of framing within a frame. So I used the prison bars to frame the characters, along with the other character in the foreground.
You're going to need it.
Don't you know what the Shadow Agency is? Don't you realize how they're using us?
I can see you've been brainwashed by Darkbeam. He was a fool. No one Shadow Beam can threaten the agency.
But I'm no Shadow Beam.
So this whole fight sequence took me a couple days to choreograph. I think it took me about a week just to think of what the two characters should be doing. So to choreograph the fight, I would sit away from the computer and just daydream, try to think of it. And I had a notepad in front of me where I could write down different move ideas. I didn't think of the whole choreography all at once, like in a sequence. I thought of different motions, different little bits that I thought were cool. And I went back and I reordered those bits to make them work logically together. So here when you see Jet Beam moving around, you can see his clothes moving so they don't penetrate through his legs. And that was all blend shapes. That was me just, sliding blend shape sliders. So this whole fight sequence took about a month and a half to animate. And this was probably some of the hardest animations I did throughout the whole movie. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I kept the environment very simple, because I knew the fighting would take a long time to animate. So when you see shots when I go from fast motion to slow motion to fast motion, it's basically the same shot. I just render it once in fast motion, 24 frames per second, and then I render the same exact shot at 240 frames per second, and then I just intercut between those two rendered frames. So to animate characters like Killer Bean hitting those prison bars, that's definitely all animation. Is not dynamic simulation. You know, ideally it would be nice if it was all dynamic simulation. Then I could do a lot more of that stuff where I could just throw those guys around. But the ragdoll simulations aren't perfect. I mean, they're great for, you know, big things like blowing up with grenades or being shot really quickly. But to do an intricate fight scene, I don't think it'll be that accurate to use, you know. I mean, the dynamic simulation is great for objects like guns and stuff like that falling on the ground, because I didn't have to animate those guns at all whenever they dropped to the floor.
You have been a formidable opponent. I am sorry I have to end this game. You already tried that.
So when you see Killer Bean eject that bullet out of his gun, I think that's really the first time you see a bullet come out of the gun, and I don't have bullet casing come out of the guns at all anywhere else in the movie. That's something I should have probably done some sort of scripting to have a bullet casing pop out every time he pulled the trigger, but that's an idea that I'd like to do for some other project, but this one I didn't have time to really figure that stuff out.
Not for you.
So this shot here, the polygon count got pretty high because of all the buildings and all those skyscrapers in the back. So I did have to render this shot in different layers, especially those buildings in the background. I just rendered those as a separate pass.
Jet Bean, is your mission complete?
Jet Bean is dead.
Killer Bean.
So basically this end scene was pretty easy to make. I really didn't do too much animation wise with this scene.
Why don't you come in? We can talk things over.
Oh, I'm coming in, but it won't be for talking. This will do.
So that's pretty much it for the CG animation commentary, and hopefully you learned a few things and it was pretty informative. Otherwise, hopefully you weren't too bored. So wake up, it's over already. All right, see you next time.